Hey, in case you missed it, here is what we talked about at Anchor on Sunday. We've been talking about the person of Jesus, who I think is the most compelling person in all of history. Not only do I think he's the most compelling person in all of history, but I think he is the most vital, important person for us today, right now. You see, throughout all of history, people who've studied our minds and how things work, and philosophers have all said this, that we are all actually trying to fill a God-sized hole in our heart. Even if you haven't found God or you don't believe in God, I think that's probably true of you as well. I know in my life, I've tried to fill that God-sized hole with different things. I want to fill it with other things besides Jesus. It just doesn't work. I always end up dissatisfied. But something else happens too. We say yes to Jesus, but then we still feel a little unsatisfied. We still feel like something's missing. Well, I think that God-sized hole in our heart, as Pascal wrote about, I think that sometimes we need to fill it as well by growing and learning and trying to do more and become more. And when we don't have the right end goal in mind, that can get really weird, right? That's why there's hundreds of thousands of self-help books and so-called self-help gurus that come and go, but Jesus is lasting forever. I believe this, that the desire to grow in every single one of us is actually a desire to become more and more like Jesus. And we talked about this. There's actually a word that the church used and made up called sanctification. Now that's a pretty complex word. Sometimes we use it in complex ways that doesn't even make sense to people like me who grew up in the church. I remember a buddy of mine in college said this. He goes, "Man, John, that was just a really sanctifying experience." Like, what does that even mean? He's like, you know what it means. Like, I don't know what it means. Because he used it in all these different ways. And if you've been confused by the church's language on certain things, I'm sorry. Sometimes we needlessly complicate things that don't need to be that complicated. Sanctification, though, is a beautiful word, I actually believe, when we get deeper into it. You see, it means this. It means to be set apart. The dictionary and our use in Scripture actually line up on this. That's how you know the church made up the word, is that sanctifying means to be set apart, or the process of becoming set apart. And specifically today, we're talking about what it means for Jesus to be our sanctifier, or for Jesus to be the one who does the work of growing us and shaping us so that we are set apart in the same way that Jesus was. Whenever we talk at Anchor, we always use the Bible, and so today we're going to be in the book of John. I'm going to bounce around a little bit from the passage just for sake of time, but if you're interested, you should totally check it out. It's John chapter 15, 1 through 11, and I'm going to bounce around a little bit, so hang with me. Jesus is teaching, though, and he says this, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so they'll be even more beautiful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." Man, these are some really powerful words. And at the end of that passage, Jesus actually says this. He says, "I'm doing this so that your joy may be complete." In this teaching of Jesus we see in the book of John, we actually get kind of the process of sanctification. I think there's 3 big stages of sanctification that we're going to talk about today. We're going to spend a lot of time in the second one, but the first one is this. Sanctification first happens when we say yes to Jesus. When we say yes to Jesus, and saying yes to Jesus is simply saying, "Jesus, I acknowledge that I can't do this thing called life on my own. I acknowledge that your way is better than my way, and I acknowledge that you died and took that punishment for my brokenness and my mistakes, and 3 days later you rose again from the dead. And because of that, I have hope and freedom now and in eternity." Here's the interesting thing about saying yes to Jesus. It feels like on its surface level, it's this simple thing that we say once and we move past. But I've found that saying yes to Jesus is actually a process. You see, in America especially, we're really individualistic. We're really proud in our own accomplishments. We like to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And so this idea that we need someone else to help us, to save us, is a hard concept. But it's so important for us to realize that when we say yes to Jesus, we are saying no to our own sense of independence and wanting to do things our way, our stubbornness, right? When we say yes to Jesus, we get to have life and life to the fullest, as Jesus would say. A lot of times we hear in the church, you need to die to yourself or become less. And that's talking about our idea of independence. It's not talking about a personality. God doesn't want you to become less of who you are. You aren't too much for God. He made you with unique characteristics that you have, and He wants you to live into that in the fullest, just according to His plan instead of our plan. The second stage of sanctification, though, is this, which is, Jesus says this in His teaching in John, it is work right now. It says, you have to remain in me as I remain in you. There's work for us to do. Here's the thing that's super important for everyone to acknowledge. At Anchor, we say this, that we are all imperfect. We are all imperfect, right? We all make mistakes. We all have brokenness, and all of us have work to do. And man, I don't like saying that I have work to do. I want to just say, I'm yes to Jesus. Jesus transformed my life, and I am good. There's nothing else I have to do. But it doesn't work that way. Jesus said this, that all of us have work to do. There are times in Jesus' teaching and life and ministry where He delighted in calling out people who didn't think they had work to do. The rich young ruler, the people who approached Him in Luke 14 and said, what do I have to do to follow you? And He said some really harsh things to them. The person who came up to Him who knew every part of Scripture, every part of the law, and said, Jesus, what do I have to do? Jesus says, love your neighbor. The guy says, who's my neighbor? And Jesus tells him a story that challenges his perceptions of race and who his neighbor is and who he is supposed to love. See, Jesus pointed out to this guy that you still have blind spots. I believe all of us have blind spots, especially about ourselves. And the thing about blind spots is this, we can't see them. We don't know what our blind spots are, which is why we need to open ourselves up to others for feedback and ultimately to Jesus. But a lot of us don't like doing work or admitting that we don't have work to do. I think when we say, I don't have work to do, what we're really saying is one of two things. One is this, I don't know how to do the work. Or two, I just don't want to do that work. I said that to my counselor in a session a couple weeks ago. There's a problem I was dealing with, and he laid out a great solution for dealing with it. And I said, Bill, you're right, but I just don't want to do that work. So if that's you when it comes to sanctification or becoming more like Jesus, I get it. I've been there. There are times where I just don't want to do the work. But here's the thing about to remember with work right now, is that Jesus says this in that John passage, there's also fruit right now. So just because there's work right now, it also means that we get to see fruit right now. So when we go and sit down to doing this work of sanctification, it's important to remember two things, okay? One is that it feels like work, but we're actually not the ones doing the work. Okay, it feels like work, but we're not the ones doing the work. So the second thing is this, is that Jesus says He will do the work. And what feels like work to us in sanctification is actually really opening ourselves up and allowing Jesus to come into our lives and do the work that only He can do. And once we say yes to that and we start to go through, okay, how do I open myself up to Jesus doing the work? There's really two types of sanctification work that I think we have. The first is what I call process work. And process work is the daily rhythms or weekly rhythms, really just regular rhythms of doing things to allow ourselves to be open to Jesus saying, here's work that you have to do and let me do that work in your life. So some examples of that could be praying regularly. Spending time with Jesus saying, Jesus, what do you have to say to me right now? Another thing we can do is reading our Bible in a way that's personal to us. I've been guilty of reading my Bible in a way that still kept it at an arm's length from my heart. See, it's really easy to study the Bible. There are scholars of the Bible who don't believe in Jesus. Isn't that interesting? Because doing a book report is not the same as sanctification. I think too often we want to go in depth in our Bible studies to do these book reports really as a way of learning academically about the Bible so we don't have to learn the heart lessons that it has to show us as well. So I would challenge you to do this, to regularly open your Bible and say, God, what does this word mean for me right now today? I think you're going to see new things when you start to read the Bible that way. Also, I think we need to do different experiences. Maybe that's coming to a class or an event at your church that you don't typically go to. We're doing one called Whole and Holy that I'm really excited about as we lean into sanctification. Maybe for you it's joining a serve team or talking to that neighbor that you're a little afraid to. So many times people say, John, I'm just not growing. I say, well, what new things have you tried? What new things are you doing? They say, well, not really anything. That's probably why you're not growing. We have to try new things. The second type of sanctification work that we get to experience is what we can call crisis work. Now, crisis work is where things in your life have hit a point that you just can't move past, and it seems impossible, and it seems like you're at the end of your rope. I remember hitting a crisis point in my life that became crisis work. My wife Rose and I had been married for about a year, and she was diagnosed with severe depression. She was spiraling and hurting and feeling she was at the end of her rope, and I was spiraling, going, man, I can't make my wife happy. I don't know what to do. And we felt hopeless. Luckily, we'd had a history of following Jesus and being a part of a church, so we did in that moment the only thing we could think of. We leaned into our church and to the person of Jesus. And can I tell you something? We got through that season. And there is fruit that I am seeing right now as a result of that crisis work that my wife and I did together in that tough season of our lives. Our marriage is so strong now because of the work that we allowed Jesus to do in our lives during that really tough period at the beginning of our marriage. Our kids are growing up in a home where we talk about our feelings, we talk about emotions. They are some incredibly emotionally healthy kids who are loving their life because of that hard work that we did. So while there was work right then for us, we are seeing fruit right now because of it. So if you're in a crisis moment right now, I just want to encourage you, hang in there. Lean into Jesus. Lean into your church community. Listen to Jesus and say, God, I need you to show up and do the work that only you can do because I know I can't do it. And I promise you this, there is hope on the other side of that. I think a lot of times sanctification can feel like a mean task or a daunting task or even a teasing task, right? I remember reading this Greek story of the guy, this hero Sisyphus, who cheated death twice, and then Zeus punished him and said, you have to roll a boulder up a hill for all eternity. And if it gets to the top, you can be done. But right when the boulder would get to the top, it would roll all the way back down. I think sometimes sanctification can feel like that, right? Where you're saying, John, you're asking me to become like Jesus, and I never will. Here are 3 reasons why this isn't actually a Sisyphean task. Okay, the first is that we're not just going up the same hill, up and down, up and down, up and down. We get to look back in our life and see the moments where God was faithful and showed up. Just like I can look back at that first year of our marriage and say, God, in the midst of a hard season, in the midst of depression, you showed up and you were faithful. And I can see that, and that encourages me to keep pushing the rock up the hill. The second is that Jesus is not this Zeus figure at the top of the hill looking down on us and mocking us. Jesus died on a hill for us. He's not on a hill mocking us. That's such a powerful distinction. Not only did Jesus die on that hill for us, but 3 days later, he rose again from the grave, defeating death and giving us hope and freedom now and for eternity. And then he said, I am with you even to the end of the age. Jesus died on that hill, and then he got down right next to us and is helping us push that rock up the hill. The third thing is while we get fruit right now, we know that sanctification is finished in the future. Right? Unlike Sisyphus in this Greek story, we get to see that there is a finish line. Jesus has promised he's going to return and make all things new. Sanctification is finished in the future. When Jesus in that passage in John says that your joy may be complete, that's not going to happen on this side of heaven. And I don't know about you, but for me, that gives me hope, and that's encouraging. Because sometimes I look at this world, as beautiful as it is, it can also be as broken. And I go, this can't be it. And the good news is that this life isn't it. If you say yes to Jesus and open yourself up to the work that he's doing in your heart, you will spend eternity with Jesus. That's that promise we see of sanctification, this becoming like Jesus will be finished one day in the future. There'll be a new heaven, a new earth, and we will get new bodies for our souls. And our souls will finally be complete. That God-sized hole that Pascal and others have talked about will finally be filled in, and we will be fully complete in our joy.